Talk. The Church. 1838. A period and a movement certainly among the most remarkable in the Christendom of the last 3.5 centuries, probably more remarkable than the movement associated with the name of Port Royal, for that has passed away and left hardly a trace behind, but this has left ineffaceable marks upon the English Church and nation. Gladstone, 1891. It was the affinity of great natures for great issues that made Mr. Gladstone from his earliest manhood onwards take and hold fast the affairs of the churches for the objects of his most absorbing interest. He was one and the same man, his genius was one. His persistent incursions all through his long life into the multifarious doings, not only of his own Anglican communion, but of the Latin Church of the West, as well as of the motley Christendom of the East, puzzled and vexed political whippersin, wire-pullers, newspaper editors, leaders, colleagues. They were the despair of party caucuses, and they made the neutral man of the world smile, as eccentricities of genius and rather singularly chosen recreations. All this was, in truth, of the very essence of his character, the manifestation of its profound unity. The quarrel upon church comprehension that had perplexed Elizabeth and Burleigh, had distracted the councils of Charles I and of Cromwell, had bewildered William of Orange and Tillotson and Burnet, was once more aglow with its old heat. The still mightier dispute, how wide or how narrow was the common ground between the Church of England and the Church of Rome, broke into fierce flame. The religious question. Then by and by these familiar contests of ancient tradition, thus quickened in the eternal ebb and flow of human things into fresh vitality, were followed by a revival, with new artillery and larger strategy, of a standing war that is roughly described as the conflict between reason and faith, between science and revelation. The controversy of Laudian divines with Puritans, of Hoadley with non-jurors, of Hanoverian divines with deists and freethinkers, all may seem now to us narrow and dry when compared with such a drama, of so many interesting characters, strange evolutions, and multiple and startling climax, as gradually unfolded itself to Mr. Gladstone's ardent and impassioned gaze. His is not one of the cases, like Pascal, or Baxter, or Rutherford, or 100 others, where a man's theological history is to the world, however it may seem to himself, the most important aspect of his career or character. This is not the place for an exploration of Mr. Gladstone's strictly theological history, nor is mine the hand by which such exploration could be attempted. In the sphere of dogmatic faith, apart from ecclesiastical politics and all the war of principles connected with such politics, Mr. Gladstone, by the time when he was 30, had become a man of settled questions. Nor was he for his own part, with a remarkable exception in respect of one particular doctrine towards the end of his life, ever ready to reopen them. What is extraordinary in the career of this far-shining and dominant character of his age is not a development of specific opinions on dogma, or discipline, or ordinance, on article or sacrament, but the fact that with a steadfast tread he marched along the high Anglican road to the summits of that liberalism which it was the original object of the new Anglicans to resist and overthrow. The years from 1831 to 1840 Mr. Gladstone marked as an era of a marvelous uprising of religious energy throughout the land. It saved the Church, he says. Not only in Oxford but in England he declares that party spirit within the Church had fallen to a low ebb. Coming hurricanes were not foreseen. In Lord Liverpool's government patronage was considered to have been respectably dispensed, and church reform was never heard of. 81. This dreamless composure was rudely broken. The repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts in 1828 first roused the Church, and her sons rubbed their eyes when they beheld Parliament bringing frankly to an end the odious monopoly of office under the Crown, all corporate office, all magistracy, in men willing to take the communion at the altar of the privileged establishment. The next year a deadlier blow fell after a more embittered fight, the admission of Roman Catholics to Parliament in place. The Reform Bill of 1832 followed. Even when half spent, the forces that had been gathering for many years in the direction of parliamentary reform, and had at last achieved more than one immense result, rolled heavily forward against the Church. The opening of Parliament and of close corporations was taken to involve an opening to correspond in the grandest and closest of all corporations. The resounding victory of the Constitutional Bill of 1832 was followed by a drastic handling of the Church in Ireland, and by a proposal to divert a surplus of its property to purposes not ecclesiastical. A long and peculiarly unedifying crisis ensued. Stanley and Graham, two of the most eminent members of the reforming Whig cabinet, on this proposal at once resigned. The Grey ministry was thus split in 1834, and the Peel ministry ejected in 1835, on the ground of the absolute inviolability of the property of the Irish Church. The tide of reaction set slowly in. The shock in political party was in no long time followed by shock after shock in the Church. As has happened on more than one occasion in our history, alarm for the Church kindled the conservative temper in the nation. Or to put it in another way, that spontaneous attachment to the old order of things, with all its symbols, institutes, and deep associations, which the radical reformers had both affronted and ignored, made the Church its rallying point. The 3 years of tortuous proceedings on the famous Appropriation Clause, proceedings that political philosophers declared to have disgraced this country in the face of Europe, and that were certainly an ignominy and a scandal in a party called reforming, were among the things that helped most to prepare the way for the fall of the Whigs and the Conservative triumph of 1841. Within 10 years from the death of Canning, the Church transfixed the attention of the politician. The Duke of Wellington was hardly a wizard in political foresight, but he had often a good soldier's eye for things that stood straight up in front of him. "The real question," said the Duke in 1838, "that now divides the country and which truly divides the House of Commons, is Church or no Church. People talk of the war in Spain, and the Canada question. But all that is of little moment. The real question is Church or no Church." Changed position of the Church. The position of the Tory party as seen by its powerful recruit was, when he entered public life, a state of hopeless defeat and discomfiture. "But in my imagination," wrote Mr. Gladstone, "I cast over that party a prophetic mantle and assigned to it a mission distinctly religious as the champion in the state field of that divine truth which it was the office of the Christian ministry to uphold in the Church. Neither then did I, nor now can I, see on what ground this inviolability could for a moment be maintained, except the belief that the state had such a mission." He soon discovered how hard it is to adjust to the many angles of an English political party the seamless mantle of ecclesiastical predominance. The changes in the political constitution in 1828, in 1829, and in 1832 carried with them a deliberate recognition that the Church was not the nation, that it was not identical with the Parliament who spoke for the nation, that it had no longer a title to compose the governing order, and a more startling disclosure still to the minds of churchmen, that laws affecting the Church would henceforth be made by men of all churches and creeds, or even men of none. This hateful circumstance it was that inevitably began in multitudes of devout and earnest minds to produce a revolution in their conception of a church, and a resurrection in curiously altered forms of that old ideal of Milton's austere and lofty school, the ideal of a purely spiritual association that should leave each man's soul and conscience free from secular chains and hireling wolves. Changed social conditions. Strange social conditions were emerging on every side. The factory system established itself on a startling scale. Huge aggregates of population collected with little regard to antique divisions of diocese and parish. Colonies over the sea extended in boundaries and numbers, and churchmen were zealous that these infant societies should be blessed by the same services, rites, ecclesiastical ordering and exhortation, as were believed to elevate and sanctify the parent community at home. The education of the people grew to be a formidable problem, the field of angry battles and campaigns that never end. Trade, markets, wages, hours, and all the gaunt and haggard economics of the labor question added to the statesman's load. Pauperism was appalling. In a word, the need for social regeneration, both material and moral, was in the spirit of the time. Here were the hopes, vague, blind, unmeasured, formless, that had inspired the wild clamor for the bill, the whole bill, and nothing but the bill. The Whig patricians carried away the prizes of great office, though the work had been done by men of a very different stamp. It was the utilitarian radicals who laid the foundations of social improvement in a reasoned creed. With admirable ability, perseverance, unselfishness, and public spirit, Bentham and his disciples had regenerated political opinion and fought the battle against debt, pauperism, class privilege, class monopoly, abusive patronage, a monstrous criminal law, and all the host of sinister interests. 82. As in every reforming age, men approached the work from two sides. Evangelical religion divides with rationalism the glory of more than one humanitarian struggle. Brougham, a more potent force than we now realize, plunged with the energy of a titan into 1,000 projects, all taking for granted that ignorance is the disease and useful knowledge the universal healer, all of them secular, all dealing with man from the outside, none touching imagination or the heart. March of mind became to many almost as wearisome a cry as wisdom of our ancestors had been. According to some eager innovators, dogma and ceremony were to go, the fabrics to be turned into mechanics institutes, the clergy to lecture on botany and statistics. The reaction against this dusty dominion of secularity kindled new life in rival schools. They insisted that if society is to be improved and civilization saved, it can only be through improvement in the character of man, and character is molded and inspired by more things than are dreamed of by societies for useful knowledge. The building up of the inward man in all his parts, faculties, and aspirations, was seen to be, what in every age it is, the problem of problems. This thought turned the eyes of many, of Mr. Gladstone first among them, to the Church, and stirred an endeavor to make out of the Church what Coleridge describes as the sustaining, correcting, befriending opposite of the world, the compensating counterforce to the inherent and inevitable defects of the state as a state. Such was the new movement of the time between 1835 and 1845. It is surprising, said Proudhon, the trenchant genius of French socialism in 1840 and onwards, how at the bottom of our politics we always found theology. It is true at any rate that the association of political and social change with theological revolution was the most remarkable of all the influences in the first 20 years of Mr. Gladstone's public life. Then rose once more into active prominence the supreme debate, often cutting deep into the labors of the modern statesman, always near to the heart of the speculations of the theologian, in many fields urgent in its interest alike to ecclesiastic, historian, and philosopher, the inquiry, what is a church? This opened the sluices and let out the floods. What is the Church of England? To ask that question was to ask 100 others. Creeds, dogmas, ordinances, hierarchy, parliamentary institution, judicial tribunals, historical tradition, the prayer book, the Bible, all these enormous topics, sacred and profane, with all their countless ramifications, were rapidly swept into a tornado of such controversy as had not been seen in England since the Revolution. Was the Church a purely human creation, changing with time and circumstance, like all the other creations of the heart and brain and will of man? Were its bishops mere officers, like high ministers of mundane state, or were they, in actual historic truth as in supposed theological necessity, the direct lineal successors of the first apostles, endowed from the beginning with the mystical prerogatives on which the efficacy of all sacramental rites depended? What were its relations to the councils of the first 4 centuries, what to the councils of the 15th century and the 16th, what to the Fathers? The Scottish Presbyterians held the conception of a church as strongly as anybody, wink with a frown. 83, but England, broadly speaking, had never been persuaded that there could be a church without bishops. In the answers to this group of hard questions, terrible divisions that had been long muffled and huddled away burst into view. The stupendous quarrel of the 16th and 17th centuries again broke out. To the Aristean lawyer, the Church was an institution erected on principles of political expediency by Act of Parliament. To the school of Whately and Arnold, it was a corporation of divine origin, devised to strengthen men in their struggle for goodness and holiness by the association and mutual help of fellow believers. To the evangelical, it was hardly more than a collection of congregations commended in the Bible for the diffusion of the knowledge and right interpretation of the Scriptures, the commemoration of gospel events, and the linking of gospel truths to a well-ordered life. To the High Anglican as to the Roman Catholic, the Church was something very different from this, not a fabric reared by man, nor in truth any mechanical fabric at all, but a mystically appointed channel of salvation, an indispensable element in the relation between the soul of man and its Creator. To be a member of it was not to join an external association, but to become an inward partaker in ineffable and mysterious graces to which no other access lay open. Such was the Church Catholic and Apostolic as set up from the beginning, and of this immense mystery, of this saving agency, of this incommensurable spiritual force, the established Church of England was the local presence and the organ. Hard questions revived. The noble restlessness of the profounder and more penetrating minds was not satisfied, any more than Bossuet had been, to think of the Church as only an element in a scheme of individual salvation. They sought in it the comprehensive solution of all the riddles of life and time. Newman drew in powerful outline the sublime and somber anarchy of human history. This is the enigma, this the solution in faith and spirit, in which Mr. Gladstone lived and moved. In him it gave to the energies of life their meaning, and to duty its foundation. While poetic voices and the oracles of sages Goethe, Scott, Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron, Coleridge were drawing men one way or another, or else were leaving the void turbid and formless, he, in the midst of doubts, distractions, and fears, saw a steadfast light where the Oxford men saw it, in that concrete representation of the unseen power that, as he believed, had made, and guides and rules the world. In that Church Catholic and Apostolic which alone would have the force and the stoutness necessary to serve for a breakwater against the deluge. Yet to understand Mr. Gladstone's case, we have ever to remember that what is called the Catholic Revival was not in England, that which the Catholic counter-revolution had been on the continent of Europe, primarily a political movement. Its workings were inward, in the sphere of the mind, in thought and faith, in idealized associations of historic grandeur. 84. 2. His religious growth. The reader has already been told how at Rome and in Naples in 1832, Mr. Gladstone was suddenly arrested by the new idea of a church, interweaving with the whole of human life a pervading and equalized spirit of religion. Long years after, in an unfinished fragment, he began to trace the golden thread of his religious growth.